Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, Freedom of Self-Consciousness, Scepticism. Scepticism is the realization of that of which Stoicism was only the notion, and is the actual experience of what the freedom of thought is. This is in itself the negative and must exhibit itself as such, with the reflection of self-consciousness into the simple thought of itself, the independent existence or permanent determinateness that stood over against that reflection has, as a matter of fact, fallen outside of the infinitude of thought. In Scepticism, now, the wholly unessential and non-independent character of this other becomes explicit for consciousness. The abstract thought becomes the concrete thinking which annihilates the being of the world in all its manifold determinateness, and the negativity of free self-consciousness comes to know itself in the many and varied forms of life as a real negativity. It is clear that just as Stoicism corresponds to the notion of the independent consciousness which appeared as the lord and bondsman relationship, so Scepticism corresponds to its realization as a negative attitude towards otherness, to desire and work. But although desire and work were unable to effect the negation of for self-consciousness, this polemical bearing toward the manifold independence of things will, on the other hand, be successful because it turns against them as a free self-consciousness that is already complete in its own self, more specifically because it is thinking, or is in its own self infinite, and in this infinitude the independent things in their differences from one another are for it only vanishing magnitudes. The differences, which in the pure thinking of self-consciousness are only the abstraction of differences, here become the entirety of the differences, and the whole of differentiated being becomes a difference of self-consciousness. Thus, the foregoing has defined the nature of the activity of Scepticism as such, and the way in which it operates. It exhibits the dialectical movement which sense certainty, perception, and the understanding each is, as also the unessential character of what, in the relationship of lord and bondsman, and for abstract thinking itself, is held to be a determinate element. That relationship, at the same time, embraces a specific mode in which ethical laws, too, are present, as sovereign commands. The determinations in abstract thinking, however, are scientific notions in which formal countless thinking spreads itself. Formal contentless thinking spreads itself, attaching the notion, in fact, in a merely external way to the being, constituting its content, and which for it is independent and holding as valid only determinate notions, even though these are only pure abstractions. A dialectic, as a negative movement, just as it immediately is, at first appears to consciousness as something which has it at its mercy, and which does not have its source in consciousness itself. As Scepticism, on the other hand, it is a moment of self-consciousness to which it does not happen that its truth and reality vanish without its knowing how, but which, in the certainty of its freedom, makes this other which claims to be real vanish. What Scepticism causes to vanish is not only objective reality as such, but its own relationship to it, in which the other is held to be objective and is established as such, and hence to its perceiving, along with firmly securing what it is in danger of losing, namely a sophistry, and the truth it has itself determined and established. Through this self-conscious negation, it procures for its own self the certainty of its freedom. It generates the experience of that freedom, and thereby raises it to truth. What vanishes is the determinate element, or the moment of difference, which, whatever its mode of being and whatever its source, sets itself up as something fixed and immutable. It contains no permanent element, and must vanish before thought, because the different is just this, not to be in possession of itself, but to have its essential being only in another. Thinking, however, is the insight into this nature of the different. It is the negative essence as simple. The skeptical self-consciousness thus experiences in the flux of all that would stand secure before its own freedom as given and preserved by itself. It is aware of this stoical indifference of a thinking which thinks itself, the unchanging and genuine certainty of itself. This self-certainty does not issue from something alien, whose complex development was deposited within it, a result which would leave behind it the process of its coming to be. On the contrary, consciousness itself is the absolute dialectical unrest. This medley of sensuous and intellectual representations, whose differences coincide and whose identity is equally again dissolved, for it is its self-determinedness as contrasted with the non-identical. But it is just in this process that this consciousness, instead of being self-identical, is in fact nothing but a purely casual, confused medley, the dizziness of a perpetually self-engendered disorder. It is itself aware of this, for itself maintains and creates this restless confusion, hence it also admits to it. It owns to being a wholly contingent, single and separate consciousness, a consciousness which is empirical, which takes its guidance from what has no reality for it, which obeys what is for it not an essential being, which does those things and brings to realization what it knows has no truth for it, but equally, while it takes itself in this way to be a single and separate contingent, and in fact animal life, and a lost self-consciousness, it also, on the contrary, converts itself again into a consciousness that is a universal and self-identical, for it is the negativity of all singularity and all difference. From this self-identity, or within its own self, it falls back again into the former contingency and confusion, for this same spontaneous negativity has to do solely with what is single and separate, and occupies itself with what is contingent. This consciousness is therefore the unconscious, thoughtless rambling, which passes back and forth from the one extreme of self-identical self-consciousness to the other extreme of the contingent consciousness that is both bewildered and bewildering. It does not itself bring these two thoughts of itself together. At one time it recognizes that its freedom lies in rising above all the confusion and contingency of existence, and at another time equally admits to a relapse into occupying itself with what is unessential. It lets the unessential content in its thinking vanish, but just in doing so it is the consciousness of something unessential. It pronounces an absolute vanishing, but the pronouncement is, and this consciousness is the vanishing that is pronounced. It affirms the nullity of seeing, hearing, etc., yet it is itself seeing, hearing, etc. It affirms the nullity of ethical principles and lets its conduct be governed by these very principles. Its deeds and its words always belie one another, and equally it has itself the doubly contradictory consciousness of unchangeableness and sameness, and of utter contingency and non-identity with itself, but it keeps the poles of this its self-contradiction apart and adopts the same attitude to it as it does in its purely negative activity in general. Point out likeness or identity to it, and it will point out unlikeness or non-identity. And when it is now confronted with what it has just asserted, it turns round and points out likeness or identity. Its talk is in fact like the squabbling of self-willed children, one of whom says A if the other says B, and in turn says B if the other says A, and who, by contradicting themselves, buy for themselves the pleasure of continually contradicting one another. In Scepticism, consciousness truly experiences life itself as internally contradictory. From this experience emerges a new form of consciousness which brings together the two thoughts which Scepticism holds apart. Scepticism's lack of thought about itself must vanish because it is in fact one consciousness which contains within itself these two modes. This new form is therefore one which knows that it is the dual consciousness of itself, as self-liberating, unchangeable and self-identical, and as self-bewildering and self-perverting, and it is the awareness of this self-contradictory nature of itself.